Okay. Up to this initial point, Spanish exploration has barely paid for itself. But after 1519, the New World is going to start making Spain so much money that it becomes the most powerful nation in the world. It's able to build this massive Spanish armada, this enormous fleet of naval ships. So, the thing that happens is the discovery of gold. The discovery of gold. So, you know, from late 1400, from 15, so for about 20 years, Spain has been busy consolidating its authority, its control of these major islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. Okay, they do find a small gold mine on one of these two islands, and they're pulling about small amounts of gold, but nothing that's even going to be able to. It's probably the only thing that's actually making this adventure profitable, because that is what the purpose was. They established their settlements on the large islands. The conquistadors come in. They enslave the populations. They place them in the mines, and they force them to grow the different crops that are being exported back to Europe. Okay. So all the time they're bringing more and more and more of these conquistadors to basically do this function. Now, 1519, things are going to change. Okay, things are going to change. A little bit of background for it. This guy, Cortez. Cortez arrives in 1504. He's kind of one of the early soldiers. He's 19 years old. He's a soldier. He's an adventurer. He's a treasure hunter. He's going to fight in the Cuban campaigns to pacify the natives on the island of Cuba. But then in 1519, after he's been there for 15 years, he gets permission to go inland to the mainland. Why? He's heard stories. Many of the Spanish have been hearing stories of a fabled kingdom of gold, so much gold that they build their streets, that they build their buildings, all these stories about this famous kingdom of gold. Now, Cortez isn't an idiot, but he understands that these fables can have a kernel of truth in reality. And so he knows there must be some place that has an abundance of gold. And Cortez wants to find it. And he gets permission. He secures permission to do an expedition to the mainland. Okay? He gets 600 men and 11 ships, and off they trot. Off they trot to the mainland. Okay? First play, he's very, very charismatic. His men will follow him anywhere. He's that kind of leader. For those of you who've ever been in the military, you know the kind of guy I'm talking about. Very charismatic, very decisive, he knows what he's doing. And so people are given confidence when they follow him. He lands on the Yucatan Peninsula, primarily, and he meets with the Mayan chief. Now, the Mayans, again, are yet to be enslaved, and they've made contact with the Spanish, and the Mayans are kind of realizing we need to keep these guys on our good side. Okay? He meets with the Mayan chief, and he tells the Mayan chief, he says, "You're the guy, aren't you? You're the kingdom of gold." And the Mayan chief says, No, that's not us. That's the people up the coast. And in order to solidify his friendship with the Spanish, he gives his own daughter to be an interpreter for Cortez, to help Cortez on this trip. Okay, she had learned Spanish already. She could translate these native languages into Spanish and give Cortez the kind of advantage that he needs. Okay, she's going to be very, very useful to Cortez as this thing progresses. Montezuma hears about these strange people being driven aloft by the clouds in giant canoes, riding around on the backs of giant dogs with their skin all white and shiny and, metal plates and all this stuff. He hears about all this stuff. And he believes it's one of their deities. He believes it's Quetzalcoatl, as was predicted. They have this kind of an apocalyptic notion of what's going to happen if Quetzalcoatl has to return. This is not good news. Quetzalcoatl coming back is not good news. This is sort of that whole end of the world scenario thing. So, he sends gifts to the coast. Gifts worthy God to attempt to appease Quetzalcoatl. Maybe if we appease Quetzalcoatl, he'll go home. He also sends a test. Okay? Amongst all of the things that Montezuma sends, he sends the ceremonial robes out of Quetzalcoatl's temple and places it amongst the gifts, believing that if this is really Quetzalcoatl, he will recognize his own robes. So, Marina, as they started calling, they named the Mayan chief's daughter Marina. They called her Marina. There's some Spanish poem about a girl from the sea, Marina, who saves Spanish sailors. She tells Cortez, she says, they think you're one of their gods. They think you're Quetzalcoatl. And Cortez, how do you know that? Well, that's his robe and blah, 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 blah. And she spills this all out for him. So what does Cortez do? Well, being the good, honest, upstanding European explorer like he is, he comes out. What do you think? Do you think he says, "Good people of the Mexica, I am no god. I am merely a man like you"? Does that sound like the story? If it were Captain Picard, that would have been the story. That's not what Cortez does. Cortez steps right up to the robes and he just slides right into them. And he struts around wearing Quetzalcoatl's robes. He tells his men, get all the horses. You, put on your armor. You, start shooting the guns at everything that will explode. And he puts on a show. He puts on a show for these people, and they are dumbfounded. They are positive now. This is Quetzalcoatl. And they go back and tell Montezuma. When they return, Montezuma realizes that this can't be good. This is bad. And so what he does is he prepares a feast for Quetzalcoatl the way he likes it. Just the way he likes it. The next morning, Cortez and his men are there on the coast. Out of the jungle comes these slaves carrying huge platters full of food and things like that. And these soldiers coming with them. And as the crowd gathers on the beach, remember Cortez has 600 men. The soldiers reach down and cuts the throats of all of these slaves and pours the blood all over the food and stuff. Just the way Quetzalcoatl likes it. You see, Quetzalcoatl is the god they do the human sacrifice to every day. You have to sacrifice to Quetzalcoatl or else the sun doesn't rise the next morning. So the daily human sacrifice is such that we have to appease Quetzalcoatl on a daily basis. Well, now, imagine you're a Spaniard, okay? You just watch these people come out carrying these platters full of food, and then the soldiers kill their own people right in front of you. Who do you think is next? Who do you think is going to be killed next? Well, you pull out your sword and you get your matchlock rifle, and it's a bloodbath. It's a terrible, terrible bloodbath on the coast. If it had been me, I might have said, whew, this is just too much. I might have left. But Cortez saw something, according to his journal. Through all this bloodbath, and once the fighting and everything stops, Cortez sees that the platters that they brought the food on were solid gold. Cortez realized, we're in the right place. And so most histories I've read says Cortez has the ships destroyed. He burns the ships so that his men can't try to escape. Because the only way we're succeeding is to go this way. And so they do. They start marching inland. Again, Montezuma and the Aztec believe these people are gods. Okay? The route that he takes. They landed at what we call Veracruz. Okay? And they make their way inland. As they're going inland towards Tenochtitlan, remember I told you they had built the city on top of this massive lake? The lake's gone now, but they built this artificial island. Cortez takes 350 of his men, only 350 men, inland to find Montezuma. Okay? When he finds the king, he holds him hostage, sort of as a puppet. He leaves him in charge, and he forces Montezuma to put his people in the mines and to bring out more gold. He tells Montezuma this. He says, we Europeans, we have a disease. It's a disease in our heart. And the only thing that can give us temporary relief is gold. We must have the gold in order to get a relief from this disease. And so he forces his men there. And they're there for about a year. Until one of Cortez's men does a bad thing with one of the young ladies who happens to be part of the nobility. And causes the Aztec to believe that Montezuma has lost the mandate of heaven, and they attack the Spaniards. Again, there's only 300 of them, 350. And so they flee. What Cortez finds out is that the Aztec here are just a small percentage of the population of the Mexica, the people who are here. Right? There's millions of them. But the Aztec control them. They rule them. And the way they do that is villages that don't pay them, that don't give them tribute, that don't provide them with the things they need, they send their warriors into their villages to capture their villagers and to bring them back. And those are the people that are used in the human sacrifice. They use terror and intimidation to keep these people under their thumb. So all of the Mexica are being oppressed by the Aztec. When Cortez comes along, all of these villages surrounding Tenochtitlan, many of them don't like the Aztec. They see Cortez as an opportunity as to get out from underneath the authority of the Aztec. Some even view Cortez as their savior, which isn't good for them. 1520, Cortez and his men have to flee. When they finally regroup, he makes friends with the Telexiclans and all these different tribes that hate the Aztec. He regroups and prepares to go back to Tenochtitlan. And so he does. He returns to lay siege to the city with his 300 and some odd soldiers, but along with tens of thousands of the natives from the surrounding villages. Okay, tens of thousands of Indians. Nobody ever wondered how 600 Spaniards could conquer the Aztec Empire? It required enormous amounts of help. The problem is, as soon as the Aztec are toppled, all of these tribal villages believe now they're liberated, now they're free, Cortez is our savior. But then, once Cortez starts sending the gold back to Cuba, and more soldiers and more chains and more men start coming, they start systematically enslaving the populations of central Mexico. putting them to work in the mines and then putting them to work in the plantations. So basically out of the frying pan into the fire kind of a scenario. This is what happens to the Mexico. Again, Cortez and his hoopla is going on here. Lots of gold mines. You can see the reasons why the Spanish stay. They do find the small gold mine in Hispaniola, but they find here in South America gold mine, gold mine, gold mines, silver mines, gold mines. There's gold mines through here, silver mines here. The precious metals here in this region is what keeps the Spanish coming to the area. Okay, Cortez and his trip into central Mexico is going to be followed a few years later by Pizarro and his trip down into South America, into what we think of today as Peru, the former Incan Empire. Okay, Pizarro, 1532, is going to Peru. He takes about 200 men, and they capture the ruler of the Aztec. Okay, Pizarro tells the people, "Bring me a ransom worthy of your king, and I will release him. I will release him." And so they do. They bring him in very short notice the largest treasure yet to be brought out of the New World in one place. Well, as soon as they bring that to him, Pizarro immediately kills the ruler, releases him to a better life. Why? Why? Because they found that treasure way too fast. They must have a lot more, and he wants it all. So again, the Pizarro and his men will start to enslave the Aztec, or excuse me, the Inca. The Inca will be enslaved, even though they have a harder time consolidating their authority in the Incan territory because of how the high altitudes involved. The Inca will provide the Spanish with enormous resources in gold and silver to be sent back to Spain. There are other explorers, like I said. I do want to mention one. I do want to mention one simply because he comes through here. He comes through Tennessee. His name's De Soto. Let me find De Soto. There's Ponce de Leon. Here he is. Hernando de Soto, 1539. He comes inland. He had been involved in the Peru campaign, and he believes he's going to find the same kind of gold and silver that they found in Peru in the North American continent. They give him 600 men and 9 ships, and when they land in coastal Florida, they start their trek inland, okay, searching for another Peru in North America. He will die in 1542, so 1539 to 1542, they stay in the inland part of America searching for civilizations that have gold and silver and things like that. Now, according to what's left of De Soto's journals that his men bring out with them, they encounter enormous number of tribes throughout all of this region. But in 1492, his men are going to bury him, and they are going to go straight to the Mississippi River and go down to the Gulf of Mexico in hope of getting rescued. This is the map that of the what we believe is De Soto's voyage. They land here. They stay the winter of 39 and 40. Then they head north. Right, we're looking through, Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, over here to Tennessee, down into Alabama, and over here. Then it gets fuzzy because we're not sure if this part of the trip ever happened, but his men say it happened. His men say it happened. It could be. This is hypothetical, and there's no way to really document whether it happened. It could be that his men killed him because he wasn't going to stop looking for the gold, and as of yet, since 39, 40, 41, 42, they haven't found any gold. But he appears to want to keep going and wanting to search more and more and more, and his men don't want to. So half of the men, when they give their stories, say, we went this direction, and then we went this direction, and then we came home after he died. The other half says, oh, we searched down here, then we searched over here, then we went up there, and then we came home. So half of the men talk about this extended journey, but that's not really something that was unilaterally agreed on. So some people think that they actually killed him. And then they jumped straight on the rivers and headed out to the Gulf of Mexico, where they believed they could be rescued. And they were, in fact. All of these journeys, all of this exploration in an attempt to find gold. Spain is using that gold. Spain is using that gold for lots of purposes. These conquistadors will be placed in charge of massive groups of almost like plantation owners, of the peasants of these Native Americans. The Native Americans will have their religions and their ideologies suppressed. They will be forced to learn to speak Spanish. All of their rulers will be killed, and they will be enslaved. They will be enslaved. And so from Pizarro and Cortez, we get the Spanish model for how this kind of exploration is going to take place. Okay, now, during this period, especially this late period, other Europeans are going to start coming to the New World in hopes of stealing from the Spanish. This is going to happen. This is sort of what Sir Walter Raleigh and some of these other, and Sir Francis Drake, they call them the Seahawks and things like that, are going to be doing. They're going to try to pick the pockets of the Spanish. This is kind of a practice that's going to continue. And so many of them are going to attempt to find a base of operations in the New World so that they can hide and wait for the Spanish, but then that's going to cause conflict between them and the Spanish, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So finish your readings of Spanish exploration and the results. One of the most detrimental effects of Spanish exploration. I'm going to jump down here. Basically, Spain is going to control all of New Spain for about 100 years. They're going to refer to this as New Spain, the New World. The Portuguese are still going to control these coastal regions, and they will speak Portuguese, what we today think of Brazil. The problem is the crown lets them continue. The crown lets them go. There are critics. There are critics. Let me move to these critics. The first are the priests with Bartholomew de las Casas is going to constantly criticize these conquistadors for their practice. How do you expect us to convey the words of Christ to a people that are being starved and enslaved? And so these priests are massive critics and are constantly sending word back to Spain demanding that they reform things. Okay? While the second kind of critic is the nobles, the bureaucrats back in Spain. They're not really concerned with the mistreatment of the Indians. What they're concerned about is one of these conquistadors can come back to Spain with so much money that they would be able to displace them socially because they'd be able to buy influence in the court. And so they want these conquistadors to be controlled. Okay? So the only attempt to control these conquistadors comes from these royal bureaucrats, but it does little effect because everybody's still getting rich. One thing does happen to cause them to take notice. Okay? Let's see, oils are getting rich. But by 1560, all the major centers of Indian civilization have been conquered. Indian leaders are overthrown. All their religious practices are suppressed. The people have been forced into slavery. Now, the toll, the human conquest. Disease isn't the only thing that's conquering these people. Even though smallpox and measles and respiratory illnesses, closely akin to things like tuberculosis and things like that, are ravaging these native populations. Okay, even more than what's taking place because of the slavery. By 1570, that's just 50 years after Cortez, by 1570, the native populations have fallen to 10% of what it was when Columbus had arrived. So that means between 1500 and 1570, 90% of the population has disappeared. They've died. They've been wiped out because of the impact of Spanish civilization on these Native American areas. The conquest and the disease. Now this does not escape the Spanish nobility's notice. This they recognize. Basically, we've lost 90% of our workforce. We've lost 90% of the workforce. Something has to be done. What is it? We will work with the Portuguese, and I'm trying to get my clicker to work, and we'll start importing slaves from Africa. It's at this point in the 1570s that African slavery, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. A kind of slave trade that the world has never seen before. A perpetual slavery that's predicated not on crime or warfare, but predicated on the fact that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time and you were enslaved. When the Portuguese bring the slaves to the Spanish put them to work in the mines. By 1550, there were only 15,000 African slaves in the New World. In 50 years, that will more than double. And then in the next 50 years, it will exponentially increase. It complicates things for the Spanish because they are very race conscious. But for the Spanish, this was a better deal because unlike the Native Americans, the Africans had already been exposed to the European diseases and had developed some of the same kind of resistances that the Spaniards and the Portuguese had. And so, plus coming from the Gold Coast and the Mali Kingdom and places like that, many of these slaves were already skilled at gold mining because massive gold mines around the kingdoms of Timbuktu and the kingdoms of Mansa Musa of the time period. And so what we're going to see is this creation of the Atlantic slave trade happens here with the Spanish and the Portuguese as a result of the Native American population being wiped down to 10% of its original strength. So next video we're going to start talking about British exploration and the planting of the English colony.